Happy Friday, everybody. It's been another incredibly busy week in the world of privacy and data protection. Jules Polonetsky here, as I hope you all know. You're on my LinkedIn page. We actually are going to move these to the FPF LinkedIn now that it is super powered to do lives as well. So we'll probably hear and talk to you a little bit more from over there. But thanks to all of you who are with us today. I'm really pleased that Christy Harris, valued member of our Future Privacy Forum team, and among other things, Christy leads a lot of our ad tech related work. And in particular, in addition to working to help keep all of our stakeholders informed on the incredible changes that are happening in the world of analytics, targeting, tracking, sandboxes, cookies, mobile identifiers, platform rules, she has launched a training course that Future Privacy Forum is going to be presenting. We are, of course, going to do ad tech because there's a lot happening, and it's a whole world where unless you really sort of live in it and breathe it and see the way that tech and data is being used, it can be hard to keep up with what is going on. But not only ad tech. Most of us are not engineers. Kudos to those of you who took the time and are tuning in and helping the world follow policy. But even if you are a master's in PhD in something very technical, actually understanding the way a particular ecosystem works and the way particular business models and advertisers and companies use data actually takes a deep dive, lots of conversations, not only understanding the what is the tech capable of, but how it works, where the data goes, who's using it, why, who's making money, who's the product, who isn't the product, right? So one of our thoughts is that there's value in not just data protection training. There are great organizations providing data protection training, from the big trainings and certifications of the IAPP to the host of many that are out there and available. What we thought we might do, since we really live at the intersection of the law, the policies, the academic research, the business activity, is do training for the kinds of things that people in legal, people in compliance, people on the business side need to understand about the way different data uses work so that you can make the kinds of policy and legal assessments you need. That's where we're looking to go. I don't know how many times during my years as a chief privacy officer, and Christy and I overlapped and worked together at AOL, where she helped play a lead role in keeping an eye and setting policies and working with the different advertising units. And so I don't know how many times, we did our privacy impact assessment or our due diligence, and we asked smart questions and we got smart answers. And it turns out, well, they were thinking about things that were different than us and they answered accurately, but we didn't think to probe in some direction because it wasn't in our scope that was even possible, and they didn't think it was relevant. And sure enough, that was the problem that we all scrambled to deal with. So getting into the details on how it works. So yes, we're going to be doing training on ad tech. Sign up, please. We're going to be talking. Chris, do you want to mention some of the others that are already queued and maybe some that are in the plan?
Yes, so we have the Fundamentals of Online Advertising coming up next week, and that is still open for registration. And then coming in May, we have the Fundamentals of AI Governance, which will touch on artificial intelligence and some of the machine learning topics. And then in July, we have a session on de-identification, which will all be hosted by our FPF internal experts. And all are open for registration right now on the FPF training website.
And the interesting point is, these are not, here's what the GDPR says about algorithmic assessments and transparency. You're reading that language already and you're puzzling it out. This is, how does machine learning work? What are neural networks, right? Is there personal information in a model? Well, probably not, but maybe so, right? What do scientists think about fairness? And look, I've spent a lot of time, as have some of the members of our team, as many of you, on de-identification, but I'm not a statistician. Once it starts getting into real serious math, I'm lost, but yet I need to have serious conversations with data people about what de-identification that meets legal standards are. And I think all of us need to get a little deeper. So that is our goal. And we look forward to you joining us. So sign up. But today, we're going to talk really big picture. And what sparked my interest in doing this is a interview that I gave to 10 Medium's publication, where I kind of look back from the DoubleClick days to today, because I feel that we're all looking at big decisions that are going to change the industry dramatically, right? Google joins the other browsers in blocking third-party cookies. Apple making significant changes about how its mobile identifiers are used. And exactly how this will play out is open. There's debates, there's legal action, there's competition policies, there's standards debates. And everyone has some opportunity to input. A lot of these are very open processes. You can sign up on the GitHub and participate in the W3C efforts and sort of agitate for what you think is right or fair or privacy friendly. But if you don't see the big picture, or frankly, there are lots of people in those conversations that are not interested in the big picture. They're interested in, what is this going to do to my business? And therefore, I'm telling you that we need this or the sky will fall in, right? There's a famous quote. It goes something like, never try to convince someone whose job depends on not understanding you, the merits of your position. I've garbled it somewhat, but the point is, if I'm, paid to want X and you don't think it's right, but if I agree with you, I might as well shut my business and go home. Guess what? You're not going to convince me. That's the way the world works, right? But for policymakers, for lawyers, for privacy folks who are trying to make sense, stepping a bit back and saying, what's happening big picture? So let's take a little bit of a tour, and Christy will help me walk through this. And my goal is to help set up perhaps a good way, at least the way we are thinking about how you should be saying, here's what we want to happen next, in a way that, supports reasonable commerce. I think we all appreciate there's value to advertising. Well, let me not say all. There are people who think it's a bad thing and it's too commercial and ought to be put in a narrow box. Power to you. We think that there's a role. We even think there's some appropriate roles for data that might be proportionate, might be necessary, might be reasonable, that might be properly controlled by consumers, but that doesn't cause Orwellian tracking, that doesn't cause spewing of data to every data broker in sight, that doesn't incentivize hate and misinformation. And I think it's possible. And I like to think most of us would like to get the balance right. And we have an opportunity now, as we see how the GDPR and e-Privacy Act are actually going to play out in enforcement, in application against companies, as US states and Congress figure out mandatory opt-outs, global privacy controls, and as the platforms make their moves, we have a unique opportunity. So let's roll. Many years ago, when I left my role as a consumer affairs commissioner in New York, defending the rights of consumers against businesses in what was the offline world. We didn't have a lot of e-commerce. This goes way back. To join a company called DoubleClick, what I came to understand when I scratched my head and said, why do we need ad networks? Why do you, the leaders, Kevin, Ryan, who went on to become a famous entrepreneur, starting many companies, Kevin O'Connor, Dwight Merriman, the founders. So why you feel you're doing great things for the world? I mean, you are passionate, smart people. You believe that you're doing something good and great. But I've come here because there's big headlines saying you're a privacy problem. Everyone is suing you. Attorneys general, the FTC, class action lawyers, those are my friends. And they're all suing you, saying you're doing bad stuff. So why do you think what you've done is so wonderful and so good? And the case that they made was, look at the world. You got Lycos, you got Alta Vista, you got the big AOL. And then you have all these other small publishers, individual bloggers, news sites, all these new entities coming, launching, and advertising doesn't work for them. Advertisers, let's take Coca-Cola. Advertisers need to reach big audiences. There's no practical way to take a little banner ad and email it, FTP it at the time, to all the thousands of sites and blogs that are out there and say, please put this up. And then, by the way, tell me how many times it's been up. Tell me how many times anyone clicks on it. You just didn't have a practical way to efficiently do that and then pay each of these different sites based on actually how many times it was displayed. These folks couldn't even predict how many times something was likely to be displayed so that you'd even know how much you were going to be billed. Everyone measured what a click was differently. It just didn't work. And what DoubleClick and the other early competitors did is they said, well, let's hire people who know how to sell advertising. Let's have them go and let's sell you all as a big old package. Because guess who does sell lots of content as a package? AOL. And what AOL's out there doing, in addition to growing their own audience, is they're buying every other little company that seems to have any scale. Sound familiar? They're watching because they're in the ISP dial-up business. They've got good insight. And as they see different sites come along, and by the way, they have a lot of market power too, because they might say, hey, do a big advertising deal with me. I'm going to put you on the AOL homepage. And if you don't, I'm going to do it with your competitor. And then you're cooked because they're going to get all the traffic. So not only do I want you to buy ads, but give me 49% of your business as part of a 10-year deal. It was rough. It was tough. A lot of this led to all kinds of legal action. The DoubleClick folks said, you do your business. You be you. We're going to package you up. And by the way, you don't have any technology? We have technology. Just put these little ad tags on your site. And guess what? We're going to start sending you money. You go do what you do. Figure out the internet. Blog, write, publish. And we're going to send you checks. And not only that, those of you who kind of are succeeding and have real interesting content, maybe you talk about how to buy a car smart and the latest models, and auto companies are going to want to be there. Or maybe you've got a lot of traffic because whatever you're doing is working. We're going to guarantee you, we will say, hey, you need a predictable life here. We see that there's regular traffic. We're going to guarantee you a certain amount of money. We are really almost in business with you. We are almost co-publishers of this page, except we just want that little ad banner. So you can see how the collective view that this was a group bonding together to be able to compete with what was otherwise only going to be an advertising market of the biggest players, the Alta Vistas, the Lycoses, the AOLs at the day, was to the entrepreneurs in this space a wonderful thing. They were democratizing access to advertising. And the fact that they set a cookie, their cookie, so they could treat these users as one big site, they weren't thinking, we're selling data, we're buying data. They're thinking, this is a co-op, this is a collective. And, you know, AOL or Yahoo was also a player at the time. Yahoo had, a big auto section, a big sports section. And again, if I was a sports interested advertiser, it made sense to go where there were lots of sports fans. There were many, many little sports blogging or sports interest sites. So the fact that DoubleClick Network, which is what they called themselves for that part of the business, could go and roll up all these sports sites and say, hey, we're the DoubleClick sports vertical. And we had a team, and they were, people who knew how to sell to the sports people, right? Every one of these kinds of buyers, has its own universe, right? The NFL, the soccer leagues, the football leagues, right? They all have particular schedules, particular timing, particular things they want. And we would hire senior experts in that space. And just like somebody represented a big sports site or a big Yahoo sports area, we represented the DoubleClick sports vertical. And they truly considered them one big package. So they were shocked when the critique, why are you creating cookie linked profiles across all these sites? These sites are selling you information. They were like, what are you talking about? Yahoo and AOL do this. We just do this for all these little guys who we handle everything. We are the de facto owner. In fact, we pay for it, the inventory for many of them in advance. Now, I'm sharing their view. Obviously, there are people here probably sitting back and saying, well, I don't know. I go to a website, I see DoubleClick data is being sent to these other third parties. That's kind of creepy. What's going on there, right? But here's where you see sort of this disconnect between where the business and what the business thought its social value was of this co-op nature. Okay. So you had this emergence of the fact that the reality that a third party, an ad network, an analytics company, could maintain state with you across other sites because of the way browsers supported the exchange of third-party cookies. And then DoubleClick realized a lot of advertisers would show up and say, what? Because someone's been to a bunch of auto sites. They're interested in autos. That's like, I don't know, because people walk past my show place and look in the window, I should go chase those people down the block. That's not how I buy now. I buy now, I sit back and I say, I sell high-end Mercedes-Benz models. My buyer is sort of this kind of person. They have a certain income. They think of themselves as, sporty. They think of themselves as, a driver who, hugs the road and makes certain right. I mean, people have different images of their relationship to vehicles, which are very much about, lifestyle and how you think of yourself, right? Are you a sports car kind of person, right? Are you the responsible, economical, environmental person? And those are the sorts of people that are of interest. Where do you have them? Here's how I get them in the real world. I buy access to the magazine list and I mail those people the brochure or the like. So DoubleClick, seeking to append actual data from catalogs and other information about you, announced its purchase of Abacus, today part of Epsilon, which is part of Publicis. And the plan was to append these identities, right? No longer were you going to be anonymous on the internet as people thought, because what you actually purchased, where you identified yourself at a catalog online or offline, would be linked to your cookie identity. And this is really what kicked off the big privacy flap. Now, Christy, were you, when you came over to the policy part of AOL, I know you had worked at a different part of AOL before, but were you in the industry at this time? This was like 2000.
Yeah, this was back in the day when it was just a burgeoning field and companies were just starting to show up to create behavioral segments and compiling profiles on individuals. And behavioral targeting firms were a business in and of itself. I was with AOL when we acquired at the time it was Dakota, and when we acquired Dakota, which was one of the predominant behaviorally targeting firms out there, and they leveraged cookies like you're talking about, being able to have code on various publisher websites across the web, unaffiliated websites, but able to basically be alerted when a user came to a website, and knowing things about that website and being able to learn things about those users, they were able to compile profiles. And that became the privacy flap around behavioral advertising. But it is very much the driver behind the ad targeting. But advertisers could then come to these firms and purchase the types of audiences they were looking for. So in your example of a high-end vehicle audience, they were able to find individuals who exhibited certain types of behaviors and then ensure that their ads were served to the audiences that were most likely to be receptive to them, providing both a relevant experience to the users as well as reaching the audiences the advertisers wanted. It made the advertising
so
much
let me hold you on this interesting comment that you said about relevant advertising. One of the reasons why industry argues that this is, you know, a wonderful thing as opposed to an Orwellian thing is they say, well, we're just trying to give you a relevant ad. And here's what I push back a little bit about, because I feel if that truly was the focus, if the focus is you're coming to a web page, you're trying to make it work well for you, we would think about it a little differently. I think people appreciate customization when it appears to be done to actually help them. But in reality, the ad isn't actually selected based on what is the most relevant ad we have that you might want based on what we know about you. Is it? What determines what ad I see when a particular user comes to a website and kind of all the code is triggered in the background?
Back in the day, it was very rudimentary, and it was, programmed based on what probably the advertiser was most willing to spend the most money.
Thank you very much. Okay.
But now there is a far more complex equation that happens in nanoseconds in the browser. When you hear real-time bidding and programmatic advertising, there is incredibly sophisticated technology that considers a multitude of attributes about the experience at that moment to determine what the best ad is to serve based on the user, the website where the user is visiting, how much an advertiser is willing to spend.
Well, but let me stick you with that how much an advertiser is willing to spend point again, right? Because again, there is an auction here, and there could be an ad that is actually really crappy and not very relevant to me. I may never click on this sort of an ad, but somebody has decided that they want to pay a lot for people like me for whatever their criteria is. Isn't that the ad that's likely to show up?
That is true. I will also say that when you make comments around whether a user is willing to click on an ad, that is not, we know that people don't tend to click on ads. That's a very infrequent outcome. It's possible and it's highly valued. Those ads are worth a lot of money, but a lot of advertisers aren't necessarily looking for that specific click. They may be trying to reach other goals, which may be brand awareness, or there may be a purchase path as opposed to the individual instance of serving an ad. Advertisers these days are telling a story, and that story is not one single instance of an interaction. It is the entire journey of a consumer or an individual from knowing about or learning about an advertiser and what they can do and understanding that advertiser all the way through to actually making a purchase and the life cycle of.
So let's explain what we mean by being able to track somebody through the life cycle. We perhaps gave the basics of the fact that when I go to a web page, if there's an ad, a cookie is being set. The company that set the cookie has seen this ID, this number that is being exchanged. Maybe they've seen it on other websites since they're serving ads on other websites. So it's clear that if I go to lots of websites and the websites have ads, there are log files and there are these cookie IDs in the hands of third parties that can be used to create a profile and then target me based on this past history. However, if I don't click on an ad, you said that it's not just about clicking on an ad. There's brand. Maybe I see the nice coloring and Coca-Cola looks refreshing, and so now I feel better about Coca-Cola instead of Pepsi. Okay. But there are a lot of people who do want us to buy, and very, very, very few people click on ads, but the marketers are able to show that you may have then showed up on their site the next day, the next week, maybe even months later, and that maybe you have purchased, in which case now, how do I find more people like you, not who see my ads, not who click on my site and waste my time, but who spend a lot of money? Give us a little flavor. And for those listening, if this is something you really want to understand, we're just chatting about it here now. This is some of the nuts and bolts that Christy and Rob Van Eyck, who is the other instructor, really walk through so you can sort of understand the nuts and bolts. But maybe a little taste of that. And I know you have some charts. I don't know if you have anything that covers this.
I don't have anything with us today that covers this, but the idea is that the user interactions are able to be tracked over time. And tracking is a creepy word here. It's not necessarily that advertisers are trying to watch and be big brotherish, but they do have a need to understand their audiences. They have existing customers that they know things about. They want to find other customers, obviously, that are very similar to those customers, to build up their customer base. They want to find other individuals that might be interested and branch out. So there is a value and a need to be able to know your audience and know your potential audiences. And the tracking technologies today allow for advertisers to do this, and for ad tech companies to help advertisers do it. Looking forward.
How does that work? Let's talk about tracking pixels, 1x1 pixels, right? Because there's no ad typically on the site that I visit.
Right. Yeah. So it's technology. So the way that the advertising works, very basically, and we get into more in-depth detail on this in our training sessions, but the concept is that there's code that is put on a website, a publisher website. So you visit, say, for example, your local news website, and they work with an ad network who puts a pixel on the page. And a pixel is really just basically a mechanism for that ad network to be able to see that user on that page and log an interaction there. They may be able to do certain data syncing from other locations. If there's a registration event, it may provide them an opportunity to compile additional information into a profile. But every time there's a pixel on a web page from a specific ad network, theoretically, they are able to then correlate information about that user, because the same pixel or the same ID that is set by that initial interaction will be referenced in every subsequent interaction with that browser in other places. So that's how the ad networks or the ad tech companies are able to correlate that in a browser setting. There are similar identifiers that provide the same types of functionality in other contexts. So in a mobile device, the apps don't necessarily set cookies. They have other identifiers that they leverage from the mobile ads or the mobile operating system that allow for the correlation of information across apps. And these are the technologies that are going to be implicated in the forthcoming changes, both from Google and what they're doing as far as re-architecting the ad ecosystem in Chrome by blocking third-party cookies or by deprecating the third-party cookie functionality, which we've already seen happen in other browsers like Safari and Firefox already have limitations on some of these technologies for the same purposes. So there's a need for advertisers and ad networks to work together to try to find a way to meet their goals in a more privacy-friendly manner without using these older technologies that maybe have been used and potentially exploited in some ways that are not necessarily within the full control or understanding of users. So that's where we see the evolution happening at a very quick pace currently.
So third-party cookies get a lot of the blame to some degree, whether they're being set because I've viewed an ad.
Barely. I mean, cookies themselves, cookies are not bad. Cookies are not a bad technology. They are not malware. They are not viruses. They're not spyware. A cookie is solely just a text file stored in your browser. And it's a matter of who gets to put that text file there. You know, if you think it's like a Post-it note that every time that company that put that Post-it note on your browser sees you, they can reference the information that they put in there. So the technology isn't bad. It's just a matter of how it's being used and the transparency and the controls of the browser users.
Now, Steve Jobs didn't think that the notion that a third party could set a cookie, which then enabled multiple entities to identify you across sites. And as a result, Safari, I don't know if it was from the beginning or very early on, something I probably ought to look into, but Safari very early on blocked third-party cookies. The marketers didn't really matter to them so much because Safari had very small market share. Mac, and still today, even with the incredible growth of Apple computers, the majority back then and even today don't use Macs. And so the fact that you couldn't do this tracking on Safari, okay, wasn't that big a deal. Safari is a much bigger deal now, because Apple does have much more significant desktop share, but significantly because Apple obviously has very, very, very important mobile market share. And it is also the case that many of you who paid $1,000 for an iPhone are the good customers that marketers want, and you are heavy browsers and users. So you see how often apps launch on iOS first. You're the people around the world with the ability to shell out, many, many, many hundreds of dollars and to keep upgrading to the newest one because we all want the flashiest and the best. And you do a lot of mobile browsing. You have a good data plan, right? I'm generalizing, but this is the way marketers are indeed generalizing. And iOS's market share with the Safari's market share is actually therefore significant. However, it isn't just Safari that has been blocking third-party cookies. Firefox, the Mozilla browser, blocks third-party cookies. I believe Internet Explorer, which has lost a lot of its market share, but still has a few percent. I believe also now blocks third-party cookies. So before we even get to some of the new changes, where Chrome, which is obviously still the leading browser, but even before we get to sort of Chrome, a big chunk of the world has said no, thank you. Now there may be people who are working around these things and doing little tricky stuff, so I don't want to take that off the table, but generally, much of the browser world has said not going to permit this particular kind of tracking. Now, obviously, when I log in, and don't be surprised that everybody wants you to log in nowadays, I can keep track of who you are if I'm logging in. I'm giving you my name. We don't even need a cookie. If somebody has your name, and that somebody is able to work across sites. Now, maybe it's a single sign-on. Maybe it's people sharing information on the back end and just matching things up really quickly. So we're going to get into what's happening, because a lot of what's happening is assessing whether one can shift from this world of third-party cookies being the sort of default identifier to other mechanisms, some of them basic. We kind of want password managers and single sign-on. Others maybe being new models of industry syncing and tracking using your name. But I just want to set up, because a lot of people are looking at this as like the world is changing. And I'm like, you didn't actually have third-party cookies for a very big chunk of the market. A lot of the people who do use Chrome, guess what? They've turned on the cookie blocking features. You can turn off the third-party cookie stuff. It messes around. It's not super, convenient, but you can do so. I'm running a bunch of plugins there because I like seeing who has those one-by-one pixels that Christy talked about popping in the background. So the Ghostery and dozens of other ad blocking, cookie tracking, cookie blocking type tools are available. So only a portion of the people who currently are using Chrome are actually being subject to that sort of tracking. So everyone out there who's selling all this magic mumbo jumbo, we're targeting ads, we're doing all this sophisticated stuff, just remember, a big chunk of the world is already blocking third-party cookies. Now, again, some people are fingerprinting, learning things about your browser because of a lot of other factors that are unique. take the training course if you want to learn a little bit more how that works. Super important for security, obviously, because,
I'll note, Jules, I think we actually might have a slide on this one about the differences in the browsers. And to your point about the blocking of cookies by Google that's coming and that has caused some upset, Safari and Firefox indeed have more technical defenses against the setting of third-party cookies, but they recognize in both instances that there is a function that those technologies serve, that third-party cookies serve, that is necessary, and instead have other mechanisms for sites to leverage that allow them to do what it is that they need to do. So the single sign-on that you're talking about, Safari with their storage access API doesn't set third-party cookies, but it does allow for access of certain data stored within the browser by third parties, and it's done in a very privacy-friendly manner to allow permissioning there. And the Firefox blocking is done in partnership with Disconnect Me, that classifies known trackers, and it is intelligent in that it monitors over time and creates, adds different trackers to their block list or permissions them based on how they behave. Safari's intelligent tracking protection, I think, is another one that was controversial when they launched it, but has actually been an interesting evolution to watch, in that it is a technology that observes how an individual and their browser are interacting, and sees if there are third parties that are trying to track information that don't appear to be, that basically appear to be circumventing the third party prohibition, but it can learn based on individual user behavior instead of taking a blanket, allow or block list approach, and instead is able to customize. So I think that's probably what we're going to see in the Google scenario as well. You hear about the privacy sandbox and the different proposals, which I believe there's upwards of 2 or 3 dozen different proposals in the privacy sandbox to address different types of needs that will be affected by the deprecation of third-party cookies. And I don't think that the problems that the criticisms around third parties that we see now, that all of that everything that happens as a result of third-party cookies is going to go away, that the entire ecosystem is not going to crumble. I think we're going to have to find other solutions to the individual goals that we're currently using third-party cookies for. And that's where Chrome will be, I think, on par with what Firefox and Safari have done so far. They may hopefully adopt consistent mechanisms that are able to be consistent across the various platforms. That'll be helpful for companies and advertisers and anybody who has websites. But I think that remains to be seen, whether the ecosystems will align or if there will be different mechanisms for the different types of browsers.
In our comments, Thomas Bisor flags Johnny Ryan's work. Johnny's been obviously doing and writing and filing complaints based on presentations that show what the current ad tech ecosystem looks like. So we talked a bit about the early network world, and you talked about how that's evolved. Maybe let's just say a little bit of a picture of the third-party real-time bidding, ad auctions, DSPs, supply side, demand side. The initials can kind of get you nuts, but it's maybe the best way to think about it is, and I think you called it an auction, right? There's an auction taking place for you based on a whole bunch of intermediaries, some who may pull more, some of them may buy ads cheap, perhaps from some, random blog or frankly, a general news network. The kinds of sites that are the most valuable are things like you write about buying cars, you write about finance, you write about the kinds of things where advertisers say, oh, someone who might be spending a lot of money on X. For better or worse, the front page of your country's local newspaper is kind of general, right? It's a way to find maybe a lot of people if they have a big audience, but they're general, and advertisers often want audience. So some of these companies specialize in buying cheap, right? They don't even have any technology. If you know a little bit of math and you understand the way this business works, you can make money. It's like being a stock trader. Here's where these sites sell their inventory, or what is unsold, after they try to sell it to their local advertisers, right? Let's say I'm a local newspaper. I have salespeople probably. I sell in my print perhaps, but I can't sell it all. So I dump it or toss it to a third party who finds other data, or finds advertiser who recognize you because of cookies that have been set elsewhere. The famous retargeting, right? The ads that track you around. You visited some advertiser's site, they cookied you, you didn't buy, you were there, or you did buy, you're a regular customer, and they want to bring you back to sell you new things, right? So by the fact that they work with a third party who has set a cookie on their site, and that third party can read that cookie at a publisher's site, they're willing to outbid others because they know stuff about you that the publisher does not, right? And again, all this is stuff you got to understand, because if you're trying to comply with data protection law and explain what purposes are and what the consents should say and what the permissions, and I think what Johnny does a good job is saying, oh my God, look at this chaos. Look at this uncontrollable blurb of data bouncing, jumping, flying. Who really knows what's going on? Is it conceivable that anybody can consent to data being thrown into a mosh pit, right? And clearly that's what's creating the pressure. We have a point, sorry, I'm leaning to the screen, from Katarina Karner, who says, well, a lot of this goes to Ireland, who's the lead regulator, and that's a problem. And look, it's true, a lot of the nationals, the Googles, Facebooks, others are there. And Ireland, of course, obviously has to deal with all the Schrems issues about the transfers to the US. But here's my question, because I think we do focus a little bit too much on our little cousins in Ireland. We got big regulators in France, in Germany, with big teams. There are huge ad tech companies in almost every European country. This is, yes, at the global level, the big platforms are US companies. But ad tech's a pretty easy business to get into. And there are players in every country, every city. And I'm not saying go chase all of them, but I just see a lot of regulators saying, Ireland, Ireland, Ireland. Okay, Ireland's got to move and do its piece, but what are you doing? Why aren't you setting the tone? Now, there are some who are, right? There are cases in Belgium. France has got, actions against Google. But, you would think that just because Ireland is the lead regulator for a certain collection of multinationals, that when it comes to ad tech, everyone else should sit and wait. The UK ICO is playing a lead role. So look, at the end of the day, this is why we have this European process. It's not just for complaints. It ought to be for really consistently setting and enforcing policy. And I'm hoping that the collaboration process amongst the EDPB and amongst the regulators really can work more effectively. Let me see. I thought I saw another interesting question. Someone says the big ad tech companies are US based, and that's where the tone is set to not respect people's privacy rights. Well, we've got some big judgments against a lot of those companies here in the US, number one. And number two, there's a host of companies, frankly, throughout the world, India, in China, in everywhere in Europe. I urge policymakers and regulators globally to set the tone. I don't think it's unique to US. We did perhaps pioneer these models, but the reality is the rule of law applies everywhere. E-privacy is pretty clear about what the rules are. GDPR is, well, I won't say pretty clear, but we see pretty clear, increased enforcement and application. But this is perhaps what is driving, this is maybe a good driver to where we are going, right? Because I think what we wanted to talk about is not the where we are today and where we were in history. We wanted to set that up. but where we are going. And Christy, you started talking about this. So is technology going to solve part of the problem? Clearly, the legal complaints, the enforcement of free and fair and full good consent via e-privacy has an important role to play. GDPR specification of purposes and the constraints that should put, and frankly do pretty much say it's really hard to do. Look, there is an effort, the TCF, as it's known, to try to do more to technically provide statements of who the parties and who the permissions are, and the regulators are looking at that to see if it's conceivable. Again, that's where I think Ryan says, how is what's currently happening conceivable? And I think even sort of the supporters of ad tech would argue the current structure really hard to fit that in to the compliance model that is really mandated by law. But are there better models? Can moving this to the browser where your data doesn't get shared make a difference? These are the proposals of the privacy sandbox. I think probably a little more detail that we can go into here today, but I urge those who are interested to go take a look at quote unquote the privacy sandboxes, which is just a place where Google has listed a bunch of the proposals that it's working on. Many of the actions are actually happening at the World Wide Web Consortium or in other areas. In a nutshell, the Google argument is Google, they say, will not be using third-party cookies for our properties. We obviously can recognize you in a first-party way across those properties. So we're not solving here the questions of whether big companies can do more than we want across their current properties. Law is applicable. You don't get to do anything you want with someone's data just because they gave it to you. So that's not the issue that's being solved here. What is sought to be solved is the issue of why can hundreds and thousands of companies who you never heard of or know be buying and trading and selling and doing stuff with the data? And so is the answer, no, they cannot actually. A lot of this might happen at the browser level, where the browser will put you into different categories based on the browser's ability to know where you are, and yet still let advertisers deliver ads based on the different categories somebody is in, but with a layer in between where you don't actually get to sort of see or track. So the very general big picture, please do take a look. A lot of the third parties of the world, however, aren't going to be part of that. The ad tech ecosystem that we talked a bit about, they're working on ways to create central identifiers that can be an alternative to cookies. Take a look at the call for comment that the IAB Tech Lab has put out, where they say, here's what we envision. Here's how privacy would be handled. Here's how transparency. We're reading through it. I know we're looking to see, can we provide useful comments? Is this a model that's feasible? And of course, the $1 million question is, will the browsers allow this to happen? Will this be a circumvention of the cookie blocking? I think it's very hard for a browser to interfere with it, because you're going to go to a site, you give your email, browser doesn't know where it goes. Mobile is a different story, right? Browser, you sign in, does the browser really know where and what you do, and whether you're going to share it with some co-op in the background that does what I described DoubleClick doing in the early days? But mobile is a different story. So how is mobile going to prevent this? And what is mobile doing? You started talking a little bit about this. Mobile never had a cookie. Well, your mobile browsing has cookies, but like we said, the Chrome, the Safari side of that was always very limited. Chrome on the browser does support cookies, but we spend our time in mobile in apps. And apps, you mentioned, don't have cookies. They provide an ID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, we saw this coming, or the platform saw the need for advertising tracking years ago. 2013, Apple launched the IDFA, which is the ID for advertising. And a year later, the Android advertising ID was available on Android devices. And these identifiers are specifically created and provided for use in advertising. And both of the platforms offer a mechanism for users to control whether these advertiser IDs are shared with various apps. We've all probably heard the news about Apple and their changes that are coming anytime now with the iOS 14.5 and switching from an ecosystem where Apple devices provided an IDFA by default and users had to choose to opt out of it, to one where if an app where an app requesting access to the IDFA will have to present a prompt to a user and get their consent before they are able to retrieve that ID and engage in tracking. Apple's policies also extend beyond just the use of that ID. So to the extent that an app uses other mechanisms to track users, collecting information from the device and using it in other contexts, sharing it with third parties or taking it off device to engage in advertising and tracking behaviors, they'll need to invoke this prompt and get consent from users. I think it's a testament to Apple and their understanding of the value of these identifiers and the need for this tracking technology that they switched this to an opt-in, that apps are able to prompt for it and get consent to do tracking on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to the model that they had previously where these settings were buried in the privacy settings of the device. They did not switch it to a default opt-in where users had to go through their settings and choose to opt in. I think they know, we all probably recognize that users are not probably going to go through their settings and find a way to turn on tracking by default. So instead they have created this framework, the App Tracking Transparency Framework, that allows for developers to prompt the user, get consent, and then proceed with their tracking and the use of third parties for tracking across apps. They also recognize that there's a need to be able to do analytics even in the absence of this consent and even without the IDFA. So Apple has created a mechanism called the SK Ad Networks, the StoreKit Ad Networks, that allows for advertisers to serve ads within apps and still retrieve a level of anonymized reporting that gives them insight into the performance of their campaigns without having to track broader or have the consent to the IDFA. So there is, I think, a recognition by platforms that there is a vital role that advertising plays, that analytics is necessary in some cases, and that they need to provide the tools to developers to allow them to do these sorts of things in a privacy-friendly manner. And that's, I think, what we're seeing in the evolution of the advertising identifiers in the mobile app ecosystem.
So people have raised questions all throughout these debates, as well as even here in our comments, about competition. So maybe useful to close with a couple of thoughts as we reach the top of the hour. First of all, in the US, if you're watching, you know that we are ramping up our competition efforts. The leadership at the White House, at the FTC, and elsewhere have all said they want to advance competition in a way that was much more hands-off and really relook and so forth. My argument is, sure, go ahead, it's important. Don't forget the privacy legislation at the same time or first, because competition often means let everybody have the data, share it more easily, frequently. In Europe, the GDPR limits what that third party does. We want portability. We want you to share, but only when the user says, or only when you're complying with an appropriate legal basis. If you don't have privacy law and you simply look at these things from a competition basis, then sure, more people sharing more data is business competitive and good for low prices. It may not be good for respecting the individual rights of a user if you don't consider their privacy a valuable right. So yes, I guess we could, and we will, maybe look past money and pricing and the fact that it's cheap, and we'll recognize that from a competition point of view, maybe you are paying with your data, so you are paying a price. But if we don't have privacy law that doesn't worry about the price that you're paying, maybe you're only paying a little price of your economic privacy. But maybe from an individual rights point of view, it's a human right that may not be so hard for me to quantify. And I don't care what it means for competition. It's about respecting an individual right? It might be very cheap to, I don't know, torture people for their money, or sell them products that are poisonous. It might be very profitable, but we don't say, well, people will only get a little bit sick, so the economic trade-off is fine, right? Only poisonous things, right? We need the privacy rules in place because then we can actually assess what it means for competition. So that's one thought. Globally, I'll say this. If I'm a, I don't know, $1 trillion company and I need to grow 10 or 15% a year because that's what the stock market is looking for, the idea that the Apples or the Googles are going to grow by getting a little bit more of the third-party ad tech ecosystem, I think is unbelievable. That is the lower margin part of this business, right? When you sell ads on your own property, if I'm Google, for instance, I sell, I pay employees, I keep the money. When I act as a provider that's arbitrating and brokering and conducting auctions and just delivering the ads, that is much more of a commodity business. And the people who get the money, advertisers pay it, the publishers get it. And yes, ad tech takes a middle slice. It's an interesting third-party ad tech sector. But for the Apples and Googles, it can add up to billions of dollars. But guess what? For some of those guys, that's a rounding error. Where are they going? Sit back. And again, maybe it's because I'm doing this for 30 years. Where are they going? Well, you don't need to be a super genius or a stock market guru to say, where is Apple going? Apple's becoming an incredibly valuable health device for me. I might have a telehealth appointment. I might download my medical records into HealthKit. I might even participate in a clinical trial type experiment, giving an informed express consent to allow my device to have certain data and detect whether or not whether I'm having certain symptoms or the like. We already also see some of the advanced features working as sort of an EKG, working to do different kinds. You can see the future. And guess what? Healthcare, that's a really, 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 really big business. And if this device becomes a key tool, whether it's real serious medical care or whether it's simply the wellness and the telehealth and the kinds of self-care that we're all interested in, that is a very big business. But guess what? That's not a business where people typically buy and sell and trade your data. So I'm sure, I'm confident. I know a lot of the folks at Apple, they believe what they're doing. Tim Cook has a deep view and I think cares. But I think it's also fair to say that if you want to be a very trusted player and you want to be in health, and if you want to be operating my automobile, and if you want to be in a number of other places where sensitivity and security are key, being respectful and being known for being respectful for how you use data is paramount. Now let's move over to Google, right? And Google also wants to be in many of these businesses. And I predict that they, both because of the legal and the regulatory pressure, right? These complaints, whether it's moving fast enough in this country or not, are telling, they're pressing in areas where they don't have the full control, where it's not even happening on their property, but where it's happening on thousands and thousands of others. It can be really hard. Any changes they make, it has this enormous, impact on this really broad ecosystem. So I predict we will be seeing many of these companies pivoting to privacy because it is in their long-term economic interest to be trusted and sophisticated analysts of our data, if they're going to be the biggest cloud providers, if they're going to be in healthcare, if they're going to be making life and death decisions for, how my car works, smart city, if they're going to be providing tools that cities use that collect data about citizens. So economically, having a share in those adjacent areas, if they're going to be in fintech and payments, very different business models. So I always say, again, follow the money. Us legal and policy people can get too caught up sometimes. Follow the money. Money is what sets a lot of the priorities when you are in the world of commerce. And of course, it's up to all of us and policymakers and data protection authorities to understand all of these dynamics so that as we interpret and assert the appropriate balances and support for rights and freedoms, we understand the most effective way to do so. So training, if you want to understand some of the nuts and bolts, where we will not wonk on about the policy stuff as much, but actually walk through how does mobile tracking work, analytics, reporting, what sort of identifiers, what sort of tracking, what sort of consumer options, how does it work? What are these new sandbox options? You will get about 2 hours, Christy?
2 hours. And we are interactive, so Q&A is encouraged. My goal is to give everybody the language, the terminology, the context that they need, and allow them to have the actual policy discussions, have their own risk analysis internally based on what companies are willing to engage in, but to be able to have the conversations with developers and the tech teams and the policy teams, knowing that the landscape. So it's about 2 hours, and it's this Thursday, and registration is currently open.
Thank you so much. Christy will be teaching it along with Dr. Rob Van Eyck. Rob has a PhD in real-time bidding, of all things to know well, but clearly you can see why it was worth his time. This is complicated stuff and important to policymakers. Rob, our managing director for Europe, was for a very long time a senior technologist at the Dutch Data Protection Authority and super involved in the previous effort by the W3C to create a do not track standard. We didn't have time. Maybe we'll come back and talk about the California Global Privacy Control, which the Attorney General, who no longer is the Attorney General, he's now the Secretary of Health and Human Services for the US, but he leveraged the new California law to create a regulation saying that we all have to cooperate with a global privacy setting, which means do not track. One of the leaders behind the effort of creating such a standard, which you can read about at Global Privacy Control, Ashkan Soltani, a leading technologist and expert and advocate, just published a blog on the website of the CNIL. So the Global Privacy Control is leaping the Atlantic. What does it mean, or what would it mean for the right to object, to do some sort of legal? I mean, the interesting thing in the US is that it has legal because it's structured in a certain way. California, and everyone does business in California, so it becomes, national in an obvious way. Some members of Congress have said they want to see it at a national level. What would it mean when used in a European context? It's not directly referenced in law, but you can see some places where you might argue, and I recommend reading the blog. We'll post it in the comments. It's on the website of the French data protection regulator, the CNIL. Thanks, everybody. Christy, thanks for taking the time. Please join her class next week. You can sign up. We apologize for charging you for it, but we talked about commerce. This is how we make a living. So, and it's certainly, I think, valuable to anybody who wants to be sophisticated in data protection. So that's how we make the money to feed Christy's cat. And you can't see my pet. It's a little Grogu, the so-called baby Yoda. He's, I think, sort of in the corner. Anyway, don't have to feed him. But have a great Friday and a great weekend. Jackson in the background, who set us up, and the FPF team. Have a great weekend. Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye.